The morning of April 15, 1945, arrived with an unusual silence over the small Bavarian town of Rothenburg ob der Tauber. The ancient cobblestones, worn smooth by centuries of merchants and pilgrims, now trembled beneath the weight of approaching Sherman tanks. Behind shuttered windows, German civilians pressed their faces against cold glass, watching as the olive-green column of the American 12th Armored Division rolled through their medieval streets. The air carried the acrid smell of diesel fuel, mixed with the lingering smoke from distant battles, while church bells remained conspicuously silent for the first time in over 600 years. For the German people hiding in their cellars and attics, this moment represented the culmination of their deepest fears. They had been told for years what to expect when the Americans came. Dr. Joseph Goebbels's propaganda machine had painted vivid pictures of vengeful liberators who would show no mercy to the German population. The Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda had distributed millions of leaflets depicting American soldiers as savage barbarians who would rape, pillage, and murder their way across the fatherland. These images had been seared into the German consciousness through countless radio broadcasts, newspaper articles, and newsreels that portrayed the approaching Allied forces as instruments of divine retribution. The civilians of Rothenburg had prepared themselves for the worst. Families had hidden their daughters in secret compartments. Fathers had buried what little food remained in their gardens. Mothers clutched rosary beads and Lutheran prayer books, whispering final supplications as the rumble of American armor grew louder. They expected brutality. They expected revenge. They expected to pay for the sins of their nation with blood and suffering. What they could never have imagined was what actually unfolded. In those crucial first hours of occupation, the reality of Germany's situation in April 1945 was far more desperate than most. Civilians truly understood. The Third Reich was collapsing from within, its infrastructure shattered, its economy in ruins, and its people facing starvation. The average German civilian had not seen real coffee in 3 years, had survived on ersatz bread made from sawdust and potato peels, and had watched their young men disappear into the insatiable maw of total war. By the spring of 1945, German food rations had fallen to barely 1,000 calories per day, compared to the 3,500 calories that American GIs consumed daily. The contrast between the two nations' circumstances would prove to be far more significant than anyone realized. When Staff Sergeant Robert Morrison of the 23rd Tank Battalion dismounted from his Sherman and walked into the town square of Rothenburg, he carried with him not weapons of vengeance, but something far more powerful and unexpected. In his field pack were K-rations, chocolate bars, and chewing gum. In his heart was a set of values that had been shaped not by propaganda ministries or totalitarian ideologies, but by American principles of justice, mercy, and human dignity. Morrison, a farm boy from Iowa whose own grandfather had emigrated from Germany in 1889, looked upon the cowering civilians not as enemies to be destroyed, but as human beings to be liberated from tyranny. The first encounter between American liberators and German civilians in Rothenburg occurred when 80-year-old Anna Zimmermann emerged from her bombed-out bakery, expecting to be shot on sight. Instead, she found herself face-to-face with Private James Sullivan from Boston, who was carefully stepping around the rubble of her shop, trying not to disturb what remained of her possessions. When the elderly woman stumbled and nearly fell, Sullivan instinctively reached out to steady her, offering her his arm for support. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to everything she had been told to expect, that Anna Zimmermann began to weep uncontrollably. This scene was repeated hundreds of times across the newly liberated territories of Germany in the spring and summer of 1945. American soldiers, rather than seeking revenge against the German population, instead distributed food, medical supplies, and comfort to the very people whose nation had brought such devastation to the world. The contrast between Nazi predictions and American actions created a psychological shock that reverberated through German society for generations. These moments of unexpected mercy would fundamentally challenge everything the German people thought they knew about their enemies. about themselves, and about the nature of power and justice. The German civilians' expectations of American brutality were not born from mere speculation or abstract fears. They were rooted in their own nation's conduct during the war, projected outward as a mirror of German military behavior in occupied territories. The Wehrmacht and SS had shown no mercy to civilian populations in Poland, Russia, France, and across occupied Europe. German forces had systematically murdered millions of civilians, had starved entire populations, and had treated conquered peoples as subhuman. The average German civilian, conditioned by years of Nazi ideology and witnessing their own military's ruthless efficiency, naturally assumed that victorious Americans would behave in kind. Heinrich Böll, who would later become a Nobel Prize-winning author, was serving as a German soldier when he was captured by American forces in April 1945. Years later, he would write about the profound disorientation he felt when his American captors shared their rations with German prisoners and treated them according to the Geneva Convention. Böll described the cognitive dissonance as learning that not all nations wage war the way we had been taught was normal and necessary. This realization would haunt him throughout his literary career, as he grappled with the implications of discovering that his nation's approach to warfare was neither universal nor inevitable. The American approach to occupation was fundamentally different from anything the world had seen before. General Dwight D. Eisenhower had issued clear directives that American forces were to conduct themselves as liberators, not conquerors. The Supreme Allied commander understood that the ultimate goal was not merely military victory, but the transformation of German society into a peaceful, democratic nation. This required winning hearts and minds, not simply crushing resistance through terror and brutality. The American strategy was revolutionary in its restraint and its vision for the future. When Captain William Henderson of the 4th Infantry Division entered the Bavarian village of Oberammergau, famous for its passion play, he found a population that had barricaded themselves in the local church, expecting mass execution. Henderson, a Methodist from Tennessee who had studied German literature at Vanderbilt University before the war, instead arranged for medical care for the wounded, food distribution for the hungry, and protection for the vulnerable. His decision to post guards around the church was not to prevent escape, but to prevent any potential acts of revenge by displaced persons or resistance fighters who might seek to harm German civilians. The symbolic power of food emerged as one of the most profound aspects of the American occupation. To the starving German population, the abundance of American supplies represented something almost incomprehensible. When Sergeant First Class Maria Rodriguez of the Women's Army Corps distributed Hershey's chocolate bars to German children in the ruins of Munich, she was not simply providing sustenance. She was demonstrating the vast productive capacity of American democracy, the ability of a free society to feed not only its own people, but also its former enemies. The chocolate bar became a recurring symbol throughout occupied Germany, representing American abundance, generosity, and the stark contrast between totalitarian scarcity and democratic prosperity. The psychological impact of American abundance on the German population cannot be overstated. For 4 years, Germans had been told that their enemies were weak, decadent, and incapable of sustaining a prolonged war effort. Nazi propaganda had consistently portrayed Americans as soft, undisciplined, and lacking the martial virtues necessary for victory. The reality that confronted German civilians was precisely the opposite. American soldiers were not only disciplined and effective warriors, but they possessed material resources that seemed almost limitless. The average American GI carried more equipment and supplies than many German units had seen in months. Dr. Friedrich Meinecke, the distinguished German historian who lived through the occupation of Berlin, wrote in his diary about the profound shock of witnessing American logistical capabilities. "They do not simply defeat us," he observed, "they overwhelm us with their abundance. Every American soldier carries more food in his pack than our families have seen in weeks. Their vehicles are newer and better maintained than anything in our army was, even at the beginning of the war. This is not victory through superior brutality, but through superior civilization. The contrast extended beyond mere material abundance to encompass fundamental differences in military culture and values. American forces operated under strict rules of engagement that prohibited mistreatment of prisoners and civilians. Courts-martial were regularly conducted for soldiers who violated these standards, sending a clear message that American democracy would not tolerate the kind of systematic brutality that had characterized Nazi warfare. This commitment to legal and moral standards, even in victory, represented something entirely foreign to the German experience of military occupation. When Colonel Robert Sterling of the 45th Infantry Division established his headquarters in the former Nazi Party building in Nuremberg, one of his first acts was to organize the distribution of surplus American medical supplies to German hospitals. Sterling, a lawyer from Oklahoma in civilian life, understood that healing the wounds of war required more than military victory. His decision to prioritize German civilian welfare over American convenience sent a powerful message about American values and intentions. The sight of American medics treating German patients with the same care they would provide to their own wounded challenged every assumption about the nature of occupation and conquest. The transformation of German attitudes toward their occupiers occurred gradually, but its effects were profound and lasting. Initial fear gave way to bewilderment, then to cautious gratitude, and finally to a fundamental reassessment of everything they had been taught about America and democracy. This psychological shift was perhaps most visible in the behavior of German children, who were the first to overcome their fear of American soldiers. The image of German children following American GIs through the streets, hoping for chocolate or chewing gum, became one of the most powerful symbols of the occupation's success. Lieutenant Ruth Anderson of the Army Nurse Corps, working in a makeshift hospital in Frankfurt, witnessed this transformation firsthand. At first, the German nurses wouldn't speak to us, she recalled years later. They expected us to treat them as slaves or worse. But when they saw that we worked alongside them as equals, that we shared our medical supplies freely, that we cared for German patients with the same dedication as American casualties, everything changed. Within weeks, we were working together like colleagues, sharing medical knowledge and even personal stories about our families back home. The religious dimension of German surprise at American behavior added another layer of complexity to the occupation experience. Many German Christians had been told that Americans were godless materialists who would desecrate churches and persecute believers. Instead, they found that American forces included chaplains who respected German religious traditions and often helped repair damaged churches. The sight of American Protestant and Catholic chaplains working together with German Lutheran and Catholic clergy to restore religious services challenged Nazi propaganda about American religious tolerance and pluralism. Father Klaus Weber, parish priest of St. Michael's Church in Augsburg, documented his experiences with American forces in letters to his bishop. "I expected them to turn our church into a stable or warehouse, as our own forces did to churches in occupied countries," he wrote. "Instead, the American commander asked permission to use our bell tower as an observation post, promised to repair any damage, and even attended our Easter service. When I saw American soldiers of different faiths praying together in our sanctuary, I began to understand something about the nature of their democracy that our leaders had never told us." The economic dimension of American behavior proved equally surprising to German civilians. Rather than looting German resources for shipment back to America, occupation forces focused on rebuilding German infrastructure and establishing the foundations for economic recovery. The Marshall Plan, which would later provide billions of dollars for European reconstruction, was rooted in the American understanding that lasting peace required prosperous partners, not impoverished vassals. This approach contradicted everything Germans had been taught about the nature of victory and conquest. When Master Sergeant Anthony Kowalski, a pre-war automotive mechanic from Detroit, organized German workers to rebuild the bombing-damaged Volkswagen factory in Wolfsburg, he was implementing American values on a practical level. Rather than dismantling German industrial capacity for shipment to America, Kowalski focused on training German workers in American production techniques and quality control methods. His goal was not to exploit German labor, but to create a foundation for German economic independence and democratic stability. The treatment of German prisoners of war provided another stark contrast to German expectations. American POW camps, while hardly luxurious, operated according to international law and provided prisoners with adequate food, medical care, and recreational activities. German soldiers who had expected execution or slave labor instead found themselves playing baseball, attending educational classes, and corresponding with their families. The psychological impact of humane treatment extended far beyond the prison camps, as released POWs carried stories of American fairness back to their communities. Colonel James Mitchell, commander of POW Camp 307 in Louisiana, implemented programs that allowed German prisoners to attend university classes, learn trades, and even perform agricultural work for wages. "My goal," Mitchell explained to his superiors, "is to send these men back to Germany as ambassadors for democratic values." A former prisoner who returns home speaking positively about American treatment will do more for our long-term interests than any propaganda campaign. This approach proved remarkably effective, as many former German POWs became active supporters of democratization and reconciliation. After their return to Germany, the contrast between Nazi racial ideology and American behavior toward German civilians highlighted the fundamental differences between the two systems. While Nazi Germany had been built on theories of racial superiority and the systematic dehumanization of other peoples, American forces demonstrated a commitment to human dignity that transcended national, racial, and religious boundaries. This was particularly evident in the treatment of German refugees and displaced persons, who received the same care and consideration as American citizens. When thousands of German civilians fled westward in advance of Soviet forces, they expected to be turned away at American lines or subjected to harsh interrogation and punishment. Instead, they found American forces establishing refugee camps with medical facilities, food distribution, and family reunification services. The sight of American soldiers helping German mothers care for their children, providing toys and candy to traumatized youngsters, and organizing educational activities for refugee families created powerful images that contradicted years of Nazi propaganda about American callousness and materialism. CTR, role of German-American soldiers in the occupation forces added another dimension to the civilian experience. Many American GIs were themselves of German descent, speaking the language fluently and understanding German culture intimately. These soldiers served as bridges between the occupying forces and the German population, translating not only language, but also values and intentions. Their presence demonstrated that German heritage and American democracy were not incompatible, challenging Nazi assumptions about ethnic loyalty and national identity. Staff Sergeant Walter Schmidt, whose grandparents had emigrated from Bavaria to Wisconsin in the 1890s, found himself assigned to his ancestral homeland as part of the occupation forces. "It was surreal," he later recalled. "I was helping to rebuild the same villages my family had left 50 years earlier. The Germans couldn't understand how someone with a German name and German blood could be so thoroughly American in his values and loyalties. It forced them to reconsider their assumptions about what it means to belong to a nation." The gradual transformation of German attitudes toward their American occupiers was reflected in countless small gestures and daily interactions. German shopkeepers began to smile when American soldiers entered their establishments. German children learned English phrases to communicate with GIs. German families invited American soldiers to share holiday meals and celebrations. These personal connections, built one relationship at a time, created the foundation for lasting friendship between former enemies. The symbolic power of American jazz music resonated throughout occupied Germany, representing freedom of expression and cultural creativity that had been suppressed under Nazi rule. When American military bands performed in German cities, playing the very music that had been banned as degenerate, they were not simply providing entertainment. They were demonstrating the vibrancy and creativity of democratic culture, showing German audiences what they had been denied by totalitarian ideology. The sight of German audiences applauding American musicians, many of them African American, challenged racial prejudices that had been central to Nazi ideology. The educational initiatives undertaken by American forces revealed another dimension of occupation policy that surprised German civilians. Rather than attempting to impose American culture through force, occupation authorities supported German efforts to rebuild their educational system along democratic principles. American officers worked with German educators to remove Nazi propaganda from textbooks, to restore academic freedom to universities, and to create educational opportunities for women and minorities who had been excluded under the previous regime. Professor Elizabeth Noel, who would later become a prominent public opinion researcher, experienced this transformation as a young German academic. "The Americans didn't tell us what to think," she remembered. "Instead, they created conditions where we could think freely for the first time in 12 years. They brought us books that had been banned, connected us with scholars from around the world, and encouraged us to ask questions that had been forbidden. This approach was far more powerful than any propaganda could have been." The contrast between American restraint and Soviet behavior in occupied Germany became increasingly apparent as the two zones of occupation developed along different lines. While American forces focused on rebuilding civil society and democratic institutions, Soviet occupiers implemented policies of systematic exploitation and political repression. German civilians who had the opportunity to observe both occupation systems quickly recognized the fundamental differences in approach and ideology. The recurring image of the chocolate bar continued to resonate throughout the occupation period, but its meaning evolved from simple sustenance to a symbol of hope and possibility. German children who had received their first taste of American chocolate in 1945 would grow up to become leaders of the Democratic Federal Republic of Germany. The sweetness they associated with American generosity became part of their fundamental understanding of what democracy could offer. Not just political freedom, but also prosperity, abundance, and the possibility of a better life for their children. As winter approached in 1945, American forces faced the challenge of preventing mass starvation in the occupied territories. The German food distribution system had collapsed, and without immediate intervention, millions of civilians faced the prospect of death from hunger and cold. The American response revealed the true character of the occupation. Rather than allowing their former enemies to suffer, American forces diverted resources from their own supply lines to ensure German civilian survival. General Lucius Clay, the American military governor of Germany, made the controversial decision to prioritize German civilian welfare over American military efficiency. "We cannot build a democratic Germany on the foundation of starving civilians," Clay argued to his critics in Washington. "Our values are meaningless if we do not live by them, especially when it would be easier not to." This commitment to principle, even at significant cost to American interests, demonstrated the depth of American dedication to democratic values. The spring of 1946 brought the first elections in occupied Germany, as American authorities implemented their plan for democratic reconstruction. German civilians, who had never experienced free elections in their lives, found themselves choosing between competing candidates and political parties. The American approach to democratization was patient and educational, focusing on building democratic institutions from the ground up rather than imposing solutions from above. When Maria Schulz cast her first Democratic vote in the municipal elections in Hamburg, she later described the experience as the moment I truly understood what the Americans had been trying to show us all along. The 70-year-old widow had lived through the Kaiser's Germany, the Weimar Republic, and Nazi dictatorship, but had never experienced the dignity of freely choosing her government. "The American soldier who helped me understand the ballot didn't tell me who to vote for," she recalled. "He just explained how the process worked, and then stepped back to let me decide for myself. That was the moment I realized what democracy really means. The long-term implications of American restraint and generosity during the occupation period extended far beyond the immediate post-war years. The generation of Germans who experienced American occupation as children grew up with fundamentally different attitudes toward democracy, international cooperation, and conflict resolution. These individuals would become the architects of modern Germany's integration into Western democratic institutions and its transformation into a peaceful, prosperous nation. The chocolate bar, that simple symbol of American abundance and generosity, found its way into German cultural memory as a representation of the moment when everything changed. In the ruins of war-torn Germany, surrounded by the debris of a failed ideology, American soldiers had offered not vengeance, but hope, not conquest, but partnership, not exploitation, but reconstruction. The sweetness of that first taste of American chocolate became associated with the sweetness of freedom itself. As the years passed and Germany evolved into a stable democracy and trusted ally, the memory of those first encounters between American liberators and German civilians remained a powerful reminder of the transformative power of mercy, restraint, and principled action. The German civilians who had trembled behind their shuttered windows in April 1945, expecting death and destruction, instead discovered that their enemies possessed something far more powerful than weapons. They possessed values that could transform enemies into friends, conquerors into liberators, and a nation of war into a beacon of peace. The story of German civilian surprise at American restraint reveals a profound truth about the nature of power and the character of nations. True strength lies not in the ability to destroy one's enemies, but in the wisdom to transform them into allies. The American soldiers who distributed chocolate bars instead of delivering retribution understood intuitively what political theorists would later codify: that lasting peace requires not just military victory, but moral victory as well. In choosing mercy over vengeance, abundance over exploitation, and partnership over domination, America demonstrated that democratic values are not merely convenient principles to be abandoned in times of crisis, but fundamental truths that define the character of a truly great nation. The chocolate bar melted in the mouths of German children, but its symbolic power endured for generations. A sweet reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, the choice between cruelty and kindness, between vengeance and mercy, between destruction and reconstruction, remains the defining test of our character as human beings. In passing that test, American forces did more than win a war. They won the peace that followed, and in doing so, they offered the world a vision of what victory can look like when it is guided by the better angels of our nature.